We've talked about the economic fluctuations model that describes the ups and downs in the economy. Now I would like to show you how to use this model in practice to make some calculations and inferences about what's going on in the economy. We're going to start with the case where there's a change in government purchases. Recall, this is what the ADIA model or ADIA model looks like. You got inflation on the vertical axis, you got real GDP on the horizontal axis, and you've got a downward sloping line, which we've called the aggregate demand line or curve, and we have a flat line labeled the inflation adjustment curve or line in this diagram. Note that we've also marked vertically with a dashed line potential GDP, and so when real GDP is to the right of that line, you say real GDP is greater than potential GDP, and of course real GDP can go to the left of that line when real GDP goes below potential GDP. So our goal here is to try to explain how to use this model in practice to make some calculations about the impact of, say, a change in government spending on the economy. To do this change in government spending is actually going to be a way for us to explain how the whole curve and model works. We're going to argue and going to show that this change in government purchases will shift the aggregate demand curve. That's the first thing we're going to notice. That's going to deliver a result that a change in government purchases affects real GDP and the whole economy in the short run. But then we want to trace out the path of the economy from those first short-run impacts, the so-called first steps, to the long run as the economy returns back to potential GDP. It's this dynamic path that it is so important to understand, and really what the ADIA model is most useful for. So let's focus on both the short run and the long run effects of a change in capital G for government purchases. To be more specific, suppose there's a sudden big decline in government purchases. Why don't we consider an example of what some of these declines might look like in this picture. This shows government purchases in the United States economy from 2007 into 2013. It's measured in real dollars, $2009 on the vertical axis. And you can see government purchases was rising quite rapidly, 2007, 2008 into 2009, and it kind of stabilized and has been falling in 2010, 11, 12 until 2013. This up and down in government purchases can have big effects on the overall economy. So there'll be short-run effects and long-run effects. And what we'd like to be able to do is use the ADIA model to try to examine those effects. So this is an example of what we're looking for. To get started, though, I want to assume that we are at potential GDP at the beginning. We're not in a recession, we're not in a boom, we're actually at potential GDP. We'll come back later to consider the role of changes in government purchases when you're in a recession or about to go into a recession. But now I'm going to assume that you're at potential GDP. Now we know that the short-run impact on real GDP will be, it will fall, it will go below potential GDP due to this reduction in government purchases. And again, now we want to see how real GDP moves over time to take you back to potential, in this case of a decline in government purchases. So the initial impact of the cut in government purchases and how it shifts the AD curve to the left is shown in this diagram. The aggregate demand curve, labeled old AD, is where you start, and that's intersecting the inflation adjustment line at potential GDP. That's where we start. Then there's a shift in the curve to the left because of the decline in government purchases. And you can see that moving over to the left there, this arrow. That's going to create a new intersection, which is right there between the inflation adjustment line and the aggregate demand curve. The inflation adjustment doesn't change because in the short run, prices and wages don't change much, they're sticky, and so inflation rates remain steady at the level indicated by the IA line. But note in this case that the decline in real GDP has left to a situation where real GDP is actually less than potential GDP. It's less by the amount shown by the thin arrow. So in this case, there's going to be some change, and that's what we want to study, is what actually happens at this point. Because this is just a short-run impact, the first step. So to see what happens, let's consider the diagram and how it changes over time. In the upper left, we have the same diagram. You see we have the old AD curve represented again. It shifts to the left, as you can see with the red arrow, and you get an intersection with the original IA line and the new aggregate demand line where it is there at that point. Again, that's real GDP less than potential GDP, and now we want to think what's going to happen. Well, with real GDP less than potential GDP, there's now going to be some downward pressure on prices and inflation. Over time, firms are going to lower their prices and wages to some extent. And as they do, the Federal Reserve will lower its interest rate. And that lower interest rate is going to stimulate consumption, investment, and net exports for the usual reasons. And so it's going to take you in the direction to the right along that aggregate demand curve towards MR. And that movement there from SR to MR is occurring as the interest rate falls. And notice it's moving GDP back towards potential GDP. It's moving back in that direction. I labeled this point MR for medium run because we're not quite finished yet, but it's different from the short run. We're not quite there yet because real GDP is still lower than potential GDP. So there's still going to be this downward pressure on inflation, and the inflation adjustment line will continue to fall. And it continues to fall until you're back to potential GDP. Just continue along that line. Because at potential GDP, when real GDP is equal to potential GDP, there's no longer any pressure on inflation to decline. So you've reached a new point, a new level of the inflation adjustment line in which it's not moving any longer. That long run point, LR for long run, just signals that point. And so what you've traced out here is a movement, originally downward movement in real GDP, going in that direction, and then a movement coming back in that direction. And over that course of time, you've had inflation declining. So that's the movement of both inflation and real GDP. That's kind of summarized in the diagram at the very bottom of the picture, this schematic diagram, which gives real GDP moving away from potential GDP over time. Now the horizontal axis is years. We're showing what happens over time now. The amount in billions is on the vertical axis. So real GDP falls below potential GDP. Potential GDP continues to grow. And your original point, labeled short run, is drawn from that diagram because real GDP is lower than potential GDP. And then you grow faster than potential GDP. You get closer to potential GDP, so the gap gets smaller. And finally, you come back all the way, and you're at potential GDP in the long run. So that's what's going on in the short run and long run with this ADIA model. Let's look at what happens at some of the supporting diagrams, because they basically just tell you what I've said in words, maybe helps remember what's going on. On the left is the good old monetary policy rule. It shows you the interest rate is positively related to inflation. In the short run, inflation doesn't change much, so we can see the interest rate at the point labeled short run. That's the interest rate to start off with. But then as inflation falls, you'll see you'll move along that monetary policy rule as the Fed lowers interest rates. And then it continues to go down as the inflation rate falls, it continues to lower interest rates. And so that is the Fed taking action as inflation changes. And those changes in interest rates have the impact on investment and consumption. And that's shown over on the right side of this page. You have the 45-degree line, as usual, and the expenditure lines shown. We're starting off at a point at the top expenditure line. And then our decrease in government purchases shifts that line down, parallel direction in that way, to a new point, and that gives us the short run effect, the short run change in real GDP. So real GDP falls as government purchases decline. That's the short run. But then, as you move to the medium run, with interest rates falling, you'll see the curve starts to shift back up again, goes out in the upward direction. And real GDP, therefore, starts to rise as you move in this direction. And that's represented by that movement in real GDP. But that's not over because interest rates continue to fall, and they'll fall all the way until you're back to the long run, and real GDP continues to rise. And as that expenditure line rises, that's representing the fact that even though government purchases remains low because of the decline, you now have had a pickup in investment with lower interest rates, and net exports with the lower interest rates and lower value of the currency, and even consumption to some extent with the lower interest rate. So it brings you back to normal in the end. You can summarize what's happening to the different components of spending, consumption, investment, net exports, and government purchases with a little table, which is shown here next to the same old diagram. And this is just a way to keep track of what's happened in the short run, labeled in the first row, SR, and in the long run in the second row. So we start off with this decline in government purchases. It's represented by the downward arrow and the under G in the short run. That's their decline. And then we're going to predict, we've already shown this, that Y, GDP will fall. That arrow goes down in the short run there. Because GDP is down, income's down, consumption's down too, because consumption depends on income, you recall. Investment's not changing because investment just depends on the interest rate, and the interest rate hasn't changed. Yet the Fed hasn't begun to react because the inflation rate has not fallen yet in the short run. You can see that exports might rise because that lower level of income means that Americans are importing less from abroad. And recall that net exports is the difference between exports and imports. So if you have a decline in imports with lower income, that's going to make net exports X rise. And so we represent that in that arrow. It's a little more complicated set of reasoning that goes into that, but nonetheless, that's the result. But then the long run is shown in the second row. In the long run, you still have that decline in government purchases. It's been a permanent decline. That hasn't changed. But now you've got the GDPY is unchanged. It's back to where it was at the beginning. Real GDP is equal to potential GDP where it was at the beginning. So that's unchanged compared to potential GDP. So it's flat, no up or down. However, consumption is actually going to be higher because that lower interest rate has stimulated consumption. Investment will be higher for the same reason, and finally net exports will be higher. And so you see that there's this change in C, I, and X that offsets the decline in government purchases and brings the economy back to normal. It's very interesting to note that in the long run, this ADIA story, this short run oriented story, gives you the same result as the spending allocation model, what we've called SAM. SAM has been for the long run, ADIA for the short run. In the long run, we already know that real GDP comes back to potential. So that means even though G has fallen, government purchases has fallen down, the others have risen. Investment, net exports, and consumption are all up. Recall the spending allocation model really tells you the same thing. It's just focused on the long run though. It just says if government purchases falls as a share of GDP, then the other components of spending must rise as a share of GDP. So the conclusion in the long run is the same. But with this new short run model, which we've been calling the ADIA model, we now have the short run story that goes along with that long run story. And they're quite consistent in the long run. And that's fortunate because if they were not consistent in the long run, there'd be something wrong with one of them. The consistency shows that both of them have the ability to deliver the right result in the long run. And then in addition, we have the short run story with the ADIA model. One more thing to think about in terms of the long run and the short run. We have seen that real GDP has fallen below potential for a while with this decline in government purchases. It returns to potential. But during this period, we've had an increase in investment. Investment is now higher by the time you're in the long run than it was in the short run. And that higher investment is most likely going to mean there's more capital. And remember, more capital means more potential GDP. Higher growth rate of potential GDP is shown in this diagram. You can see it sort of tilts upward a bit after the long run is reached. And that's representing the fact that it's quite likely that this greater amount of investment is increasing economic growth. It may be higher as shown here. And so that's how the short run relates to the long run as well. So that's how this model works. With a particular example, one could consider the reverse, an increase in government purchases, and you could consider other kinds of shocks as well. The next thing we want to consider is what happens when there's a change in monetary policy. That's for next time. Thank you.